The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning with no return address, and inside it was a photograph I had not seen in 4 years, me and Donovan at 22, standing in front of the house his family had spent 3 years trying to demolish, both of us laughing at something outside the frame, his hand on my shoulder like he owned the whole world and was willing to share it. Someone had written on the back in blue ink, in handwriting I did not recognize, "Before she understood the price." I set it on my kitchen table. I looked at it for a long time. Then I picked up my phone, opened my spreadsheet, and added one more line. The question I kept getting asked: how does a woman with a sick mother, a part-time job at a bar on Friday nights, and a company that had been declared bankrupt walk into a boardroom full of people who had written her off and hand them the document that ended every one of their plans? That question has a very specific answer. And it starts not with that photograph. It starts with the moment I understood what I had actually been sold. But to understand how it ended, you need to understand how it started. And how it started was with a man named Sha Fong, a design competition, and my mother's habit of filing patents for every piece of work she truly loved. My name is Song Shi. That is the name on my employment records, on my studio license, on the 3 legal filings I submitted to the court over a period of 14 months while working 40 hours a week and visiting my mother in the hospital every other evening. My mother's name is Song Ching. She was, before everything collapsed, one of the most respected designers working in traditional cultural heritage textiles in the country, a woman who had spent 20 years developing a signature approach to intangible cultural heritage elements, blending Miao and Shi ethnic group traditions with modern construction in a way that the industry had never quite seen before. She was also, by the time I was 23, lying in a hospital bed in a coma she had been in for 2 years, the result of a car accident that the Shah family had arranged the week before she was supposed to present her evidence to the competition board. Nobody called it attempted murder. They called it a traffic incident. That word. Remember it. It matters later. I need to tell you about the world before the fall first, because the people who eventually tried to use me as a bargaining chip in their business dealings were not strangers. They were the people I had grown up around. The Shah family had been connected to my mother's work for years. Shah Fong, the patriarch's second son, had come to my mother as a mentee when I was still in middle school, charming and attentive and apparently deeply interested in intangible cultural heritage design. He was in his mid-30s then, with the particular gift of men who have grown up watching powerful people perform warmth. He knew exactly which questions to ask, which memories to honor, which pieces to admire. My mother trusted him completely. That was her design. And for years, it seemed like he deserved it. Then came the 2021 competition. Then came the accusation of plagiarism. Then came the judge who had been paid, my mother's sudden accident on the way to submit her evidence, and the 4 years I spent working nights at a bar to pay hospital bills that arrived every month like a subscription I had never signed up for. Nobody called it theft. They called it industry politics. That sentence. Remember it. Because everything that came after made sense once I understood what it really meant. I want to be specific about the money because the money is the part that makes this real. In the 2 years following my mother's accident and our company's bankruptcy, I accumulated the following: medical bills averaging $50,000 per month for 24 months, which is $1,200,000 total. Legal fees for 3 separate filings, attempting to contest the plagiarism ruling, attempting to access the competition board's internal communications, and 1 civil filing I prepared myself on a kitchen table at 2 in the morning, totaling $87,000. Lost income from the studio that was forcibly closed. Our projections for the year of closure had been approximately $400,000 based on confirmed contracts. The salary I earned as an intern at a major corporation, a job I had taken in good faith, not yet understanding that the man who had arranged my hiring was the same man whose family had arranged my mother's accident, was $36,000 for 8 months of work that included managing international client communications in English, covering a presentation that landed a $60 million contract, and absorbing responsibilities that were nowhere in my job description. The total, when I finally built the spreadsheet, was $1,323,000. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I started a new document. People think revenge begins with anger. Mine began with a spreadsheet. The specific invisible work I was doing during those 2 years is the part that nobody ever asked about, because the people who benefit from invisible labor are extraordinarily skilled at not noticing it until it stops. I visited my mother every other evening and spent 30 to 40 minutes talking to her, about things she had loved, about work she had done, about the competition, about the pieces she had designed that I was quietly, methodically recreating from her original notes. The doctors had told me that familiar voices and topics increased the chances of her regaining consciousness. I took that seriously. I also maintained 3 part-time jobs simultaneously, a restaurant during the day, a convenience store in the afternoon, and a bar on weekend nights. I filed legal motions without a lawyer. I researched competition board structures in my lunch breaks. I learned, over the course of 14 months, the exact procedural language required to request internal documentation from an industry body that had never, in its 20-year history, been successfully compelled to release anything to an outside party. And I did all of this while being, to the world, a woman in a rented apartment with calluses on her hands and no visible power whatsoever. My competence was invisible. My desperation was invisible. The one time I was acknowledged, a man named Ken Yuan, who had once told a room full of people that I was so low he wouldn't look at me if I stripped naked in front of him, pulled me aside at a professional event 6 months later and said quietly, away from everyone else, that he had heard I had won a civil motion against a company 3 times my size and that it was, in his words, impressive. He said it in the hallway, away from his colleagues. The next morning, at the same event, he introduced me to someone new as, and I am quoting directly, a former society girl who had come down in the world. That is the one I recognized. The private acknowledgement wrapped in the public humiliation. That was the moment I understood the full shape of what I was dealing with. And that's when I stopped feeling hurt and started feeling clear. The warning sign I had been missing was not subtle. I had simply refused to see it because I wanted the story to be different. Joe Hu, the man who had been in my life for 3 years of college, who I had ended things with on the morning my family fell apart because I did not want to drag him into a disaster I couldn't yet measure, who I had not spoken to in 4 years, had come back. He was Wall Street's rising star. Top 10 on Forbes. He was also, by a particular series of events I had not planned, now my boss. This fact alone was uncomfortable enough. But it was the night at the Shah family's cocktail party that crystallized everything. Xiaoling, the Shah family's daughter, who had known perfectly well I was with Joe during college and had spent 2 years pursuing him behind my back with the confidence of someone who assumes that proximity to power is the same as deserving it, was standing in that room with the posture of a woman who believed she had already won. She had Joe. She had the family connection. She had the engagement that was being discussed in corners. She looked at me in my rented dress and she said, with the particular smile of someone performing generosity from a position of total safety, sure, you haven't been to a gathering like this in years. Why don't you stay and relive some old memories? I looked at her. I looked at the room. I thought, she genuinely believes this is still a competition she is winning. I drove home that night and I sat in my car outside my apartment building and I thought about what I actually had. A mother with a documented history of original patents. A habit we shared of filing intellectual property protection for every piece we loved. A case that nobody had ever actually closed. And 4 years of documented attempts to access competition board records. I went inside. I opened my laptop. And I started building. They thought my silence meant surrender. Every single night, I was counting. The documentation phase was 4 months of the most precise, methodical work I had ever done, which is saying something, given what the previous 2 years had required. I requested, through the formal legal process I had spent months preparing, the internal scoring records from the 2021 competition. I cross-referenced them against publicly available information about the judge who had given my mother's work a failing score while simultaneously awarding Xiaofeng's work that incorporated techniques my mother had developed and patented, a perfect 10. I pulled my mother's patent filing dates. The patents were filed in 2020. The competition was in 2021. The math was simple. Xiaofeng had submitted work using techniques my mother had patented a year before the competition date. Either he was a thief, or he had somehow developed identical techniques independently, and the patent dates made that argument legally impossible. I also found the payment. Not easily. It took 3 separate requests, 2 of which were returned on procedural grounds, and 1 escalation that required me to cite a specific clause in the industry board's own charter that they had apparently forgotten existed. But I found it. 5 million. The judge's name. A wire transfer dated 2 weeks before the competition. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I printed the document. It was 38 pages. Tabbed into 5 sections. The cover page had 1 line, for the record. Songshi, on behalf of Song Qing. It looked calm. It was the most powerful thing I had ever held. Stay with me. Because this is where it gets good. Let me take you back to the competition floor now, because you know what I know, and what happened there looks completely different once you understand the full weight of what I was carrying. The Xia family's collection came out first. Xiaofeng had prepared an intangible cultural heritage series, beautiful, technically accomplished, deeply familiar to anyone who knew my mother's original work. The judges scored it, 9, 8, 9, 10. The room applauded. Xiaofeng stood at the front with the expression of a man who has rehearsed this moment. Xiaoling stood beside him. Then my collection came out. And when it did, when the audience saw the cloud collar paired with elements that the host correctly identified as Qin dynasty royal tribute techniques that had been considered lost, something shifted in the room. The scores came, 5, 9, 10, 10. 2 perfect scores. And then the judge who had been paid gave 5 points and called my work unoriginal. I had been waiting for this. I wish I could tell you I felt nothing. What I actually felt was the very specific satisfaction of a person who has set a trap and watched it trigger exactly as designed. I stood up. I said, the one who should be blacklisted from this industry for taking bribes and maliciously scoring contestants is you. The room went quiet. I looked at my phone. I had sent the documentation to every attendee's registered device 30 seconds before I spoke. The 5 million. The judge's name. The wire transfer date. I watched the room read it. I watched Xiaofeng's expression change the way color leaves a face, slowly at first, then all at once. Then my mother stood up. And that was the part none of them had prepared for. She had woken up 3 weeks earlier. I had been talking to her about the competition, about Xiaofeng, about the patents, about what I was building, and she had heard me. She told me later that she had tried to wake up for 3 weeks and simply couldn't, and that the moment I described finding the patent files, she felt something pull her back. She walked onto that floor in the middle of everything and she said, I am Song Qing. I am the one whose designs were stolen by Xiaofeng and falsely accused of plagiarism. And then she produced her own copy of the patents. The ones she had filed before he had ever touched the techniques. The ones she had been filing, quietly, for 20 years, because she loved her work that much. That was their first mistake, believing a woman in a coma was a woman who had stopped accumulating evidence. The machine started failing the way expensive things always do. Quietly, then all at once. The first crack came the morning after the competition, when the industry board's internal communication system, which had been running on credentials associated with the judge who had just been exposed, locked down automatically as part of the board's emergency fraud protocol. 3 accounts were inaccessible by 9 in the morning. By noon, a lawyer named Jen who had been handling the Shah family's intellectual property filings for 11 years called my studio number. His message was brief. He was calling to assess the situation and suggested a conversation at my earliest convenience. That word. Convenience. He called it convenience. On Wednesday, a business partner of Shah Fong's, a man who had been present at every one of the Shah family's social events for years and had personally told me at one of them that the Song family's bankruptcy was a lesson in overreach, sent a formal letter requesting a meeting to discuss, and I am quoting the letter directly, the possibility of a mutually beneficial resolution. I did not respond. On Thursday, Xiaoling's father sent a message through a mutual contact asking if I would be willing to accept a private settlement before any additional legal proceedings were initiated. The contact said he used the phrase, keeping this between families. I said, I'll be at my studio. If he has something to say, he can come here. The confrontation happened in the Shah family's own offices, which I had chosen deliberately. I arrived prepared. The packet was on the table before anyone else sat down. The cover page was visible. The room had 6 people in it, Shah Fong, Xiaoling's father, 2 lawyers, and 2 board representatives who had agreed to be present as official witnesses to any statements made. Shah Fong entered last. He looked at the packet. He looked at me. He used the voice he saved for moments when he was performing calm, low, measured, the voice of a man who believes that composure is the same as power. Songshi, he said, you've always been impulsive. Your mother was the same way. It's why she made mistakes. I said, page 1. He looked at the cover. Page 3. He looked at the patent dates. I watched his lawyer lean over and begin to understand the math. Page 17. That was the wire transfer. I watched Shah Fong's hand stop moving on the table. He tried 4 times to reframe it. He said the patents were a coincidence. I said, page 3. He said my mother had misremembered the dates. I said, page 3. He said the judge had scored fairly and the payment was for unrelated consulting work. I said, page 17. By the 4th attempt his language had shifted from defense to negotiation. He mentioned, carefully, the possibility of a public statement, of a formal acknowledgement, of a restructured arrangement that could benefit everyone. I waited until he finished. Then I stood up. I said, the police have a copy of everything on this table. You have until the end of business today. And I walked out. What happened in the weeks and months after did not surprise me. I want to be honest about that. I had watched families like the Shah family for long enough to understand their structure, and I had learned something that I want to say plainly. Families built on the suppression of one person's talent to sustain another person's reputation are not stable. They are time bombs with elegant casing. Remove the suppression and the whole thing detonates from the inside. Shah Fong was arrested. The judge was removed from the board. 3 of the Shah family's major business relationships were terminated within 60 days as partners quietly began reviewing their association records. Xiaoling's father attempted to arrange a meeting with my studio through 2 different intermediaries. Both times I sent the same response: any communication should go through my legal representative. The house that had been sold to pay my mother's bills was returned to us. That part one had not planned. What happened next, I had not planned. But I should have expected it. The partial redeemer came on a quiet evening in the form of Xiaoling herself. She had not arranged the meeting through anyone. She simply showed up at the studio, which took a kind of courage I had not anticipated from her, and sat down across from me without waiting to be invited. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not broken, Xiaoling was not the kind of person who broke, but diminished in the way that people become when the structure they have been leaning against is no longer there. She said, I knew what my second uncle did. I didn't stop it because I thought it would be better for everyone if it just went away. She paused. I knew that wasn't right. I just told myself it was complicated. She did not say she was sorry. I respected that more than I would have respected the word. I listened. I did not soften. I said one sentence, I know. She left 20 minutes later, and I sat in the studio for a long time afterward thinking about the architecture of families like hers, families that stay functional by designating one person to absorb the cost of everyone else's comfort, and then calling that person difficult when they stop absorbing it. Remove the person who was absorbing the cost and the cost doesn't disappear. It simply lands on whoever is standing closest to where they used to stand. What Xiaoling was sitting in, that night in my studio, was the cost her family had been routing through other people for 20 years. I did not enjoy watching her carry it. But I did not offer to take it back. The final call came 6 weeks later, from a number I didn't recognize. Xiaofeng's voice was different on the phone, quieter, with none of the measured authority he deployed in professional settings. He said he had something that had belonged to my mother. Not money. Not an apology. A small carved wooden case that she had used to store her first completed patent filing, a piece she had designed when she was 29, the year before she met him, the year she had decided that her work was worth protecting. He said he had kept it. He had not meant to, he said. He had picked it up during the period when he was reviewing her design archive, the same archive he had mined for techniques he then claimed as his own, and he had kept it for reasons he couldn't now articulate. He asked if I wanted it back. I said, you can mail it. It arrived in a brown paper package with no note. I opened it at my mother's kitchen table with her sitting across from me, drinking tea and watching me with the expression she had always had when I was doing something she didn't fully understand but trusted completely. Inside the case was her first patent filing, folded into quarters, with her handwriting in the margins, small corrections, a note about proportions, a tiny drawing of the finished piece. I looked at it. Then I looked at my mother. Then I laughed. She asked what was funny. I said, he kept it this whole time and had no idea it was the thing that would eventually prove everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed too. I framed it. It is on the wall of the studio now, next to the competition certificate from the year we finally won. I want to speak directly to you for a moment, because there is something in this story that I think matters beyond the specific details of what the Xia family did and what it eventually cost them. I know some of you are carrying something right now that nobody is recording. Work that disappears the moment it is done. Labor that only becomes visible the moment you stop performing it. Talent that has been borrowed without credit, expertise that has been claimed without acknowledgement, years that have been spent building something that someone else decided they deserved. I want you to understand what I learned, slowly, and then all at once. The people who take from you without asking are only able to do it because you have not yet decided that what you have is worth protecting. My mother taught me to file patents. Not because she was suspicious of everyone, but because she loved her work enough to put her name on it in a place that could not be erased. That habit, maintained quietly over 20 years, was the thing that ended 20 years of theft in a single afternoon. The trap was not the confrontation. The trap was the documentation. The confrontation was just the moment I let them see what I had built. I did not destroy the Xia family. I simply showed the room what they had always been. They did the rest. My mother as well. My studio is open. The collection from the competition has been licensed internationally, and the techniques that were stolen and then returned now carry our name in the official record. Joe is in the story too, but that is a chapter that moves at its own speed. Some things do not happen on a deadline, and I have learned to be patient with the things that matter. What I can tell you, from this side of it, is this: the photograph that someone sent me with the note about knowing my place was supposed to remind me of how far I had fallen. What it actually showed me was how long I had been preparing without realizing it. My mother's greatest gift to me was not her talent. It was her habit of writing her name on the things she made, quietly, carefully, in a place no one thought to look, so that when the time came, the truth was already in the record. They thought silence meant she had given up. It meant she had already won.